Winder is not outside of Atlanta. This is a video for educational purposes to counter misinformation and racism. The mainstream media has been talking a lot about Winder and saying it's outside of Atlanta. And this is racist and misinformation because Winder is not outside of Atlanta. Winder is a tiny town well outside of Atlanta. So in one sense, it is outside of Atlanta. Like every other town in the world that's not in Atlanta is outside of Atlanta. But usually when you say outside of Atlanta, you would be referring to a town like Marietta or Alpharetta, or a town that's right outside of Atlanta. Winder is well outside of Atlanta, like every other town in Georgia. It's halfway to Athens, where I grew up, but I also lived in Winder. You're not going to see a lot of videos correcting this because Winder doesn't have a lot of population. There's not a lot of people who've ever lived in Winder. It's a tiny, tiny town. So the reason you haven't seen anybody else saying, hey, Winder's not outside of Atlanta is because there's not many people there. And it would take a lot to get to see their videos if they were talking about this, like it probably will mine. But anyway, the reason they're talking about Winder is unfortunately another Trump-Boutonniere terrorist has murdered people there. But that should tell you right there, the reason you've never heard of Winder before, there's never been a reason to talk about Winder ever before, is because it's a tiny town. The only reason they're talking about it now is because a terrorist struck there. And in the few days between when that terrorist murdered people and when another Trump-Boutonniere terrorist attempted to murder people in Kentucky on the interstate, they were talking about Winder and calling it outside of Atlanta. Now, why is that racist? Because why would they say it's outside of Atlanta if it's not? I did see another video from like LA local news about this story where they said Winder is northwest of Atlanta. If anything, it's due east, maybe a little northeast or southeast, but it's east of Atlanta. It's definitely not northwest of Atlanta. Why people can't just be bothered to check a map before they write a story or repeat lies. Anyway, they've been saying it's outside of Atlanta, which ties it to Atlanta. I'm not saying that people in Atlanta would be offended to say that Winder is outside of Atlanta, or people in Winder would be offended to say it's outside of Atlanta, although they certainly would. Some people would. I took a cultural geography class at UGA, go dogs, and they had us draw a map of the South. And it seemed like about half the class, lots of people from Georgia in the South, drew a circle around Atlanta, excluding Atlanta from the South because they were racist or had some racist ideas that because Atlanta was a black city or had a lot of black politicians, population, rich black people lived there, something like that. Some reason why it was culturally outside of the South. That's not true. Of course, it is like the capital of the South. Atlanta is like the forefront, the frontier of the New South. And Winder, not so much. Another thing that's kind of racist about saying that Winder is outside of Atlanta is that it implies that when one of the four people that the murderer shot, the Trump-Boutonniere terrorist murderer shot, was black, that was, the odds are. When actually in Winder, you might have to look for, I'm not saying he was intentionally targeting the black student, but there wouldn't be as many as in other places in Georgia, because Winder is, again, a small town in the country. When I lived there, there was a cow pasture behind my house, and I think a cow pasture across the street. It wasn't even really a neighborhood. It was just some houses on a road. Winder's really tiny, and it's terrible that this is what it made the news for, but again, not surprising because it's such a small town, you wouldn't have heard of it otherwise. Why people can't just double check things and avoid misinformation? Saying it's outside of Atlanta is trying to paint it as potentially crime that Republicans want to associate with black people, therefore associating it with Atlanta. The mainstream media did a lot of this. The mainstream media does a lot of bias reporting, especially on certain issues like Gaza and police and racial issues and these types of issues where they never really mention or they never really emphasize that every one of these terrorists is always a Trumper, a Trump-Boutonniere, every single time, every single one, and that's a problem that we should identify. When they could paint people with Islamophobia and talk about people in that way, they were quick to tell you affiliations of people if they could find them. But now they won't because they're trying to protect them. In the same way, I'm afraid they're trying to protect the Trumper in the woods in Kentucky by just letting him run around. This is seemingly a minor detail to talk about Winder being not outside of Atlanta, but it's been making me angry every time they were talking about it. For the few days they were talking about it before the next Trumper terrorist took over the headlines. But I wanted to say something about it still, and hopefully this will help educate some people about racism, about the media, and about geography. Winder is not outside of Atlanta. Any more than every other city in the world is outside of Atlanta. But culturally, it's not like Atlanta because it's a tiny farm town in Georgia, like a lot of Georgia towns are, besides just a few that have more culture and progress and understanding of things. But that's spreading throughout Georgia. So thankfully, Georgia will be better everywhere. And hopefully, Winder is better than I'm characterizing it even today, because it's been a while since I lived there. But again, you'd hear more about this if Winder was outside of Atlanta, because there'd be a million people living there instead of a few thousand or tens of thousands. And there would be more people to talk about it. So get it right, news people. Stop spreading things, even if it's subtly promoting racism. That's too much. We got to call it out and stop all racism and Trumpism. Thank you.